Welcome back to the High Performance Herd podcast, where we explore how leaders create teams, cultures, systems, and accountability required to produce remarkable results. Today's guest has built his career across multiple countries, industries, ownership structures, and stages of business. David Hewitt began his career at a young age, taking a turnaround assignment in China while still in his 20s. Since then, he's led startups, global business units, large corporate initiatives, multi-company transformations, and some private equity-backed organizations. Today, he's CEO of Hyperion Solutions, a designer, manufacturer, and distributor of components used throughout elevator systems. David, welcome to the High Performance Herd.
Thanks for having me, David. Excited for the conversation.
Super. So I almost always start with, when did you first understand or have the desire that you wanted to lead?
I think it started, as it does for most people, probably subconsciously during kind of early childhood and early adulthood. So my father was a great example for me in the way he conducted himself. He was in the military, and then he ran his own business. And so I saw him in action. And I also kind of got exposed to business at a young age. So sometimes I would join him on business trips, and I would be at the business events when he ran his own company. I used to get really, really excited when the fax machine would go off and a purchase order was coming through the fax machine. And so I kind of got some subconscious buy-in to leadership there through him, then through school and sport specifically. So, I grew up in England, and rugby was a big sport for me, and leadership through tough situations in the match kind of came out of me there. I then very much got excited reading about leaders in history. So I studied history. Military history was a personal passion of mine. Strategists. And so I kind of saw that in, people like George Patton, who was an American general, as one example, but multiple leaders. So I think subconsciously I was kind of infused with what a good leader looks like and why good leadership is important. And then, more directly answering your question, I got an opportunity at a relatively young age to start up a business in China. And once I got exposed to that, I fell in love with leadership. Like there is no better job.
So I'm curious, I'm going to go all the way back to your dad's influence. Was that influence kind of hey, I'm watching, or was there a more explicit, here are lessons, David, from your father?
It was a combination of both. I certainly watching him, how he would conduct himself, how he interact, but also he infused in me competitiveness, winning the right way, but winning and playing to win. But also setting a good example to people, whether you're leading people or it's just people in general. That was his upbringing, and I think he infused it in me, hopefully.
Awesome. So you talked about the China opportunity. When we talked last, you even said kind of went against your dad's advice, if I remember. He was like, go to Australia, take the easy thing. And you were, no, I'm going to go choose the hard thing. So talk a little bit about that decision.
Well, he was right, as he often was. But it still turned out okay. So I was extremely adventurous and somewhat ambitious, and I was given the opportunity after backpacking. I left the UK, I left my job in the UK, and I backpacked Asia, and that was a great experience, very humbling. But I was given 3 opportunities around the same time. One was to work in Japan, where I just done a consultancy job, and they wanted to offer me a full-time role. One was to go be a sales director in Australia, as you mentioned. And that was the one my father was like, take that one. You're young, go enjoy life. You'll have a good time. And one was to return to my last company to do a startup in China. And I chose that one ultimately because I felt like it was the most unique. It was unlikely to happen again. And it would be the most challenging. And it was. So my father was right in that it was an extremely challenging 5 years in China. an extremely challenging role. Um, and, and so I had a different experience than I had going to Australia, but in terms of learning, how to be a leader, making a whole ton of mistakes and, um, it, it was the best choice. And I don't think my career would be where it is today had I not taken that assignment.
Yeah, which is interesting. It says, hey, I chose this hard thing. If you reflect on it now and go, Here's what I learned most. Here's how I grew, matured. Here's how my leadership was honed," whatever kind of hits you, what would you tell the listeners? Here's what I took from that experience.
That I think you can be successful and a good leader in any culture, no matter how different it is, in any environment, if you spend the time to listen and to learn from not only customers, but your team. And that you do a good job of soliciting their input to come up with your North Star, to come up with your kind of strategic plan, your strategic direction. If you go out of your way to communicate that upfront, you're a bit patient upfront to get that input. When you go to execute, you're going to get much better buy-in. I would also say the reality is results matter, and the ability to get results quickly matters. It gives you a lot of oxygen to make those mistakes and to learn. And that was perhaps obvious, but that definitely was an experience working in China.
You also talked when we talked last time that this was a hard role because, at least for you, from a perception standpoint, that, hey, I'm young, I'm still learning. Most of the people you're managing were much older, more experienced. I think you might have even said, "Hey, I felt like I was a little bit in over my head."
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So talk about that because I have a similar experience, David, which was my first job in the Navy. You report aboard the ship as 22 years old. You're in charge, and you're like, in charge of what? Because you know nothing. There's a
Yeah.
chief that works for you that's been doing this for 20 plus years, and you're in charge. And so that it hits home for me, and I'm curious how you approached that. You talked a little, but share more about that.
Well, my approach. Look, firstly, I would say a few kind of things that might be useful to people before I answer the question directly, which is that I would encourage everyone where they can to get international experience, to go live in a different country, to work in a different country, because it will test you. I would say probably don't go to China to do your first management role. Because you're learning how to be a manager for the first time and you're learning how to do business in a very different culture. But definitely get that international experience. The way I approached it was to literally just devote myself to it. I worked extremely hard and I studied extremely hard. I went out of my way to solicit input from mentors. I went to all the kind of Chamber of Commerce events. I went to all the networking events. I read a huge amount of books. And one of the things about my experience in Shanghai in China was that on every street corner, they had books for sale. They had DVDs for sale. And I would constantly, after almost every few days after coming home from work and getting on the metro, I would pick up a new business book and I would read about business leaders and business philosophies. I was also very fortunate that the parent company, a company called Illinois Tools and Works, so ITW, a big American corporation, had a phenomenal toolbox, lean management, lean manufacturing tools that I was able to learn. So to answer your question, I really just poured myself into it and I worked extremely hard. I worked far too much. I think I might have said to you previously, I could probably have produced 80% of the results with 50% of the effort in hindsight. But, when you're in over your head, like, what do you do about it? You just power through and that's what I did. And then the final point I would say is, I'd like to think I had the humility and self-awareness to listen to my team, and to realize that I was in many areas in over my head. I was certainly in a different culture that I didn't understand fully at the beginning. And so I had the situational awareness to listen to them and learn from them. And that helped a whole bunch too.
I'm curious because my experience was almost identical to what you said. Like I had to read and learn. I had to learn about things that I had no idea that I would need to learn about. 2 weeks into my first stint, we're having a diesel engine inspection, and we have to pass this diesel engine inspection, and I had no idea. And I leaned on the team. I asked questions. I was curious, but I also poured over things to say, well, this is what the regulation says. Help me understand how we're meeting it. And so there's a curiosity, yet also, as you said, like, well, we got to get the result. So there's this subtle push behind it all and if I go back to my definition of leadership, I didn't realize it at the time that I was inspiring them to believe in something and then take action toward it
Yes.
without really fully understanding that that's what I was doing at the time by demonstrating curiosity, the willingness to push. Hey, there's a higher standard. And all of that with a real dose of naivety and humility at the time for me. And I'm curious if yours was similar or something different.
No, you just said something that I think really resonates with me. You said naivety, and I think whether it's naivety or it's just that kind of massive overdose of confidence, I remember when I was reading history and I was like studying the Battle of Britain, and you would see these young pilots that would go up to fly, and they were fearless because they didn't know any better. And then kind of the older pilots who've been doing it for a while, and I'm sure, with your background, you probably had similar experiences. You just don't know, you don't know any better. And so you don't fear the risk. And so you're very confident, you take more risk, you're very adventurous. And that certainly was the case for me. Again, I was very fortunate that because of the kind of the business that I inherited when I started up, I could afford to take risks, and the downside was not massive. It wasn't like I was inheriting a large scale business where reckless decision had massive downside. And so that was very fortunate as well. But the naivety thing that you just mentioned does resonate.
Yeah. I mean, you've described also, the entrepreneur's journey. When there's not much at risk, you're
Yeah.
willing to take a lot of risk. As your business grows and you have a lot more value, that becomes a harder pill to swallow, taking a bunch of risk when you go, well, I got $1
Yes.
million business versus I have $100 million business versus I have $1 billion business.
Yes.
You handle all of that risk differently. So, you also talked about in China that leadership requires this judgment around pace. You talked about measure twice, cut once at times, and others you were like, well, I need to act without all the information.
Yes.
Um, I'm always, because this is true in all situations. Do I wait for more information? Do I act? How do I do that? For you, either there or later in your career, how do you decide? How do you look at
Mm.
this choice of, hey, wait for more information, be deliberate, or no, act? And, that's often some intuition experience, but I'm curious how you think about it today.
Yeah. Great question. And I would say I learned that later in my career, kind of subsequent to China. At China, I recruited the entire team. It was a startup. And so I was able to operate at a high intensity and a high pace. And because I had recruited in that image, it worked. And because, as you just described, it wasn't like I was inheriting a large business, the need to measure twice, cut once wasn't there. But subsequently, quite quickly, following that assignment, and the next role I had was a leadership role in the US, that became very apparent to me. And so I think the answer to your question is just experience, self-awareness, humility, and experience. So even today, and you can go the opposite way. You can go to the point where you're excruciating and like wanting to know all the details and wanting to have everything planned because you're so afraid of making a mistake that you just don't get something done. And then, to quote George Patton, um, an average plan executed aggressively today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow, or something similar to that. And I think that's true. And so now I do weigh up. Do I need to measure twice and cut once? Or is like knowing 60% or 70% of the facts good enough? And if we get it wrong, we get it wrong, but it's not a problem. It's just been experience.
So you alluded to next roles. Let's just do the quick career path post China.
Yes.
and the rationale is you want to share for the next move. So you leave China, why, and head where?
So I left China after 5 years to the US, and it was an easy decision. So my company offered me opportunity in the US to go to a turnaround. So it was a startup in China and then Asia. We expanded operations to Asia, and then it was a turnaround in the US. And it was an easy decision because the US was then and is now a phenomenal country. And I remember growing up, my father always kind of idolized the US. I think, he would have wished he'd lived in the US. And so I think based on my personal experience and his view, I was super excited to work in the US. And quite frankly, it was a good opportunity for my career. It was now going to run a mature business, a larger business that needed a turnaround. And so it was an easy decision. The role was in Chicago, and that sounded exciting as well. And after 5 years in China, which is a wonderful country, but it's a brutal assignment, going to a country where you're a little bit close to the culture, the language for sure, was also appealing.
And your role in Chicago, talk a little bit about it.
Yeah. So it was to lead an aftermarket P&L, and to provide technical and field services and spare parts for inspection equipment that would go into the production line of food companies, beverage companies, in some cases, pharmaceutical companies as well. And without giving too much away, they needed a step change in terms of attracting and retaining talent, in terms of being operationally more efficient at, giving a better customer experience and then monetizing that customer experience. And this was an organization where it was pretty full in terms of people who'd been there for a while. And so whereas in China, I could kind of build a team in my image, now I was inheriting a team. And so that completely different management style. And so I, and also the Midwest of the US was a new experience as well. So I had to kind of adapt myself in a way that you had mentioned earlier, which is like if you run too fast, too intensely, you might burn people out, and you might look behind you as a leader, and not many people are able to follow because, quite frankly, it's not what they want. It's not appealing.
So talk about that transition. So you find something that says, hey, I need to move through the step change, I think is how you talked about it. And talk about that journey, what it required, how you led, what changes you need to make.
So the things that were true in China were true here in regards that we had to come up with a clear vision and strategy and align the organization behind that vision and strategy and then execute. So what I did there, which is what I did in China and I've done in subsequent roles, is I spent a huge amount of time up front interviewing customers, interviewing employees, understanding strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And then distilling that down into a very clear, this is who we want to be, this is how we're going to get there, and these are the KPIs we're going to use to measure ourselves on that journey. And then we're going to visualize those KPIs in a way that everyone can understand. We're going to align incentive plans behind those KPIs. And so you have a very focused, mobilized organization. That's true in all the roles. But what I would say was a learning experience for me was, how do you get people to come along with you on that journey? How do you get people to care about it? How do you get people, how do I adapt my leadership style to recognize that some people want to run fast and some don't, and that's okay, and how do you work with that? And this is probably more exclusive to me, but as a leader, I realized quite quickly I had to invest time in getting to know them personally. And that for me was a relatively new experience. And it's not to say I didn't have relationships with my team in China, but you spend 10 minutes talking to them about the weekend, about how a family member's doing, about how is this going, about how's that's going, before you then talk about, right, we're going to have to really, really work faster. We're going to have to really work harder. And that was a learning curve. And also recognizing that you have to structure success around people that want to work 9 to 5 and not more than 9 to 5. that was a new experience as well.
And you successfully, I assume, transformed that organization a little.
Yes.
And you talk about these personal relationships, getting them off the 9 to 5. There's to me, almost every one of these stories goes, well, I was inspiring them to believe in something different. If you go back to that, well, what were they believing when they got there? And what were
Yeah.
they starting to believe as your leadership impacted them?
Yeah.
How would you talk about those two things?
Yeah. Well, I would say just quickly, I think still people work 9 to 5. I mean, maybe it was 8:30 to 5:30, but like that was okay. But I think people worked with more purpose and they worked with more enjoyment. And the reality is I inherited and I recruited a good bunch of people, but they hadn't been winning. They'd been losing. They went from, again, try not to give too much away. They went from the least successful part of the P&L to the most successful part of the P&L. Their NPS, Net Promoter Score, went from something that needed improvement to actually very, very good. Our first time fix rate, our response time went up dramatically. Our ability to attract and retain talent went up substantially. And that success motivated them and mobilized them by itself.
So David, I always, when I ran companies, thought about this as I need to fuel the magnet that compels the behavior that I want. And that, that comes from core values, that comes from vision, that comes from leadership. And that the more we do that, the stronger the magnet becomes, that compels and repels. That it starts to, I would joke, like Sesame Street. Most of us are like the others. And that, the more we became like, that we want to win, that there's an incentive that's driving that behavior, that we're all on the same page and we have a shared fate and we're moving together. And you use the word winning. That's how I'd often talk about it. Like, it's a lot more fun winning. You talked about early competitiveness and the desire to drive results. That was always apparent in my leadership. Like, we're going to get results. We're going to win. We're going to be the best. And that's what we were marching toward. How did you move the organization that way? You talked about relationship, getting to know them, but what else? What were the building blocks behind that?
Yeah. Okay. So, they had a strong input, so their voices were heard into what should the strategy be, and how do we, where do we want to get to, and how do we get there? That was their plan. They had input into that, so they're being listened to. We introduced visual performance boards and daily huddles and weekly meetings. So now they're being communicated with. So we've come up with this plan together. They've got all their fingerprints on that plan. Now they can see how they're marching against that plan. Now we're talking about that plan. And now we're putting people on the right roles to execute that plan. That was the key ingredients.
And David, the I'll call it cadence and metrics that you talked about there, was that anything formal? Was that an EOS traction, similar type system?
It was just born out of kind of common sense, pragmatism. I used the word daily huddles. I didn't even know the phrase at that point. It was just to me, like, it was just common sense. We've agreed what we want to achieve. We're going to measure how we're achieving against it. Let's put it up on the board every day so that we can see it, and let's talk about it every day.
Well, it's funny because many ascribe to EOS, Pinnacle, scaling up, and the systems are all the same. It says, well, where do we want to go? Let's create a vision, and then let's attack the vision, and all the way down to a daily huddle. Like, are we doing the right things today to get us to this long-term goal?
Yes.
And, a lot of those have other cadence metrics like quarterly rocks and a scoreboard and a weekly focus. But, it all boils down to, are we doing the things to move us toward the end goal? Nick Saban talked about this. He would use a lens at Alabama football that he would ask the incoming football players, like, well, what do you want out of your experience here at Alabama? So he was involving much like you did. And they would say, well, I want to start on Saturday, or one day I want to play on Sunday in the NFL. And he talked about that in an interview I heard, that he would love that, because then he would go, well, is what you just did helping you play on Saturday? Is what you just did going to allow you to start on Sunday one day? And, it's a, with an end in mind, are we taking action toward it? And are we getting the results we desire? And I love that you're like, I just did that in a common sense, pragmatic way. Like, we need to do the things
Yes.
to get to the goal. And I talked about earlier, David, this shared fate, that we understand that we're all headed the same way, that we're all going to win or lose together. Sounds like you put metrics and things in place. Did you have people on the team that said, yeah, I don't want this new thing?
Yes. Yes.
Almost always, I figured. And
Yeah.
how did you and the organization handle that?
Yeah. In that kind of first role in the US, I probably handled it less delicately than I would now, and later in my career. I think at the time I just powered through it. Like, this is what we're doing. And in some cases, I would give credit. In many cases, and this is why success is important, because if you're suddenly winning and success is important, like, it doesn't. Regardless of the leader's ability to communicate, like, okay, people are like, this is working, this is great, I'm winning now. But yeah, there was substantial pushback, and I would say that this was part of the learning curve. Like, how do you can interpret it as negativity, you can interpret it as people don't want to change, and there's some degree of truth in that. But you can also interpret it as like, this is phenomenal frontline employee feedback that you can use to turn it around and to make it better.
David, awesome. I think that we see that all around us, and examples that are moving in the right direction and not. Here I live in Bloomington, Indiana. We experienced that last year with, a team that was the losingest football team in college history, winning a national championship after 2 years with a leader that said, we're going to win. And, he's talked a lot about it post that early on, the school administration, a lot of people didn't believe, and he needed to convince them that, no, we can believe, we can win here. I believe it. And he talked about getting everyone else to believe it. And he was clear that some didn't. And
Yes.
what he was able to do is then, well, if you don't want to win and you don't want to be part of this, then you need to move on somewhere else.
Yes.
And, you talked about earlier in your career powering through, and, he talked about it as like, well, yeah, with every major win, people believe more. So the results
Yes.
start to move you that way. But there were also still people that go, I don't want to work that hard. I don't want to work in this environment. I want the old 9 to 5, mail it in. And so I'm sure you had people that you go, yeah, we need to transition.
Absolutely.
And how did you handle that at that point in your career? And how would you handle it today, if there's any difference today?
There are moments when I think about the version of myself when I was younger, and I wonder if I was better in that aspect then than I am now. Because, and I'll tell you what my answer is, and then maybe you can give you some coaching on this yourself. I moved with it very decisively, very quickly back then. Now I would communicate. I would do a lot of effort to communicate it to the broader organization for them to understand, why am I making this decision with this one individual, so that they don't see it as a threat for themselves. Whereas back then I would say, like, this is the example we're setting. Everyone should be clear. And we're doing it. So I move slower now than I did back then in making these decisions, but I also, in parallel, do a lot of communication and, clear alignment with the person and check-ins with the person to give them every opportunity to be successful. And sometimes I worry I've taken it too far the other way versus early in my career where I was just like, just get it done.
Well, David, very similar. As I left running companies and became a Vistage chair, I named my company Helping Bulls Thrive in China Shops. Was a coaching consulting, because I was the bull in the China shop. I was the disruptive. I had a boss that said, don't worry about filling out your travel schedule, because everywhere you go, someone calls me. Like, I know where you've been because I'm getting the phone call. So similarly, that's why I asked the question. I think a lot of us early in our careers, in the pursuit of results, make rapid change. And, my replaying of it and the subtlety that I was after is, well, how am I fueling the magnet? I go back to that metaphor for myself all the time. Like, am I communicating in a way that people understand it? Do people understand why we're making the transition? Do they see with intentionality or see the intentionality behind this is what we want here? Because if they're guessing, then there's not a directional like, and I think you talked about it, then it becomes a fear thing. Then it becomes, could this happen to me? So there's a subtlety in that. And I think as we become more patient / think we can fix, we may hold on too long. And then I'm always left with, in my experience with leaders, well now you're acting in contradiction to the way you want to fuel the magnet. You're allowing poor performers to stay here too long. How do your top performers view you? So, as we look at this, managing teams, this is one of the subtleties of, well, how do we communicate? How are we demonstrating? I always go, we're fueling the magnet that compels and repels the right behavior and repels the wrong behavior. How are we doing that? So you eventually leave the Chicago role after what sounds like success. Can you talk about the success before you talk about your next role?
Yeah, it was. I'm proud of the team, and I'm proud to say it was transformable success. I mean, we improved the net promoter score by like 35 plus. So we took it from average into good. We were generating a good amount of EBITDA with the most profitable part of the segment. Our first time fixed rate was, 85, 90%. Our response rate was within 48 hours. We grew the top line substantially, like double digits year on year. So in every metric, the goal was achieved. And then I was, and this is great. And I'll talk about this as we go through my career. I'm about to say that sometimes the successes actually don't teach you as much as the failures do. And so that might be an obvious statement, but it's so brutally true. So at this point in my career, like, okay, I had 5 excellent years in China. I've had 2 excellent years in this, so like everything's working. I then got a promotion opportunity to lead a larger business on a broader functional basis, in St. Louis, Missouri, which again was slightly different culturally. And that was good too. And then I was offered an opportunity to be based in New York City, which is where I wanted to be for kind of personal reasons at the time. And to do a startup for a private equity in the aftermarket space. And it was completely greenfield. And that was very humbling as well. I'll pause, David, because I'm not sure if you want to ask any questions about that transfer before I keep talking.
No, I think keep going through the career. We'll get to Hyperion and then we'll spend more time there. But there were some early lessons that I wanted to call out, and now it becomes kind of like, hey, let's move through the career. Brilliant. Just as you're doing. It's perfect.
Brilliant. Okay, and so so doing a startup was quite humbling because it was a startup in every regard. It wasn't like I was starting up a business in Asia for a global organization with a global brand and global relationships. Now I was doing a pure startup where there's no brand recognition, no infrastructure, no history. And that it was very hands-on.
And David, the idea originated where?
So it originated with the private equity, whereby they saw an opportunity within the food and packaging industry, where if you were to walk a production line, you had multiple machineries from multiple OEMs, and therefore you had multiple service technicians coming in to service just one part of it. And so the idea was, what if you could do a one-stop shop solution from end to end to provide for service and all of that equipment? And then what if you could provide this aftermarket organization to global OEMs that didn't have enough scale in the US to do it themselves? So the logic was sound, and it was a very good idea. The interesting thing is, when you try to be a master of everything, you lose focus and you lose expertise and you lose depth. And I mean, I'm being very specific here in terms of a business model, but I think, that is a very key message for a leader, I would say, overall. And I'm deviating a little bit here, but I like this because it's important to me. I think it's over my shoulder somewhere, but there's a book by Michael Porter on strategy, which I read a long time ago, and I love it. And one of the statements that he made, which stuck with me, which is that strategy is choosing what you don't do and who you're not. And whether it's in business when you're trying to, as a business model, or whether it's as an organizational strategy and an organizational alignment, that like prioritizing what you're going to focus on and what you're not going to be and what you're not going to do is massive. And I found that increasingly through my career. So I deviated a little bit there, but I think it's something that I learned, and I still practice today. So back to the business, it was focused on end-to-end production lines, and we had successful 2 years. We scaled it from $0 to $20 million. We sent a bunch of OEMs. It was very successful. But then I had an opportunity that came to me. I wasn't looking; someone came to me to do a startup for a large global company in the publicly traded in the life sciences and pharmaceutical sector. And the opportunity was to start up this segment. And it was exciting. And again, I could be based in New York City, which I wanted to be for personal reasons. I could now travel globally. I could go back to the UK. It was also working for an organization that had a very strong foundation in a Danaher business system type, which I found appealing. And so I took that assignment. And that again was extremely humbling, because as you change industries, as you go to a new environment, and there's a lot of people who, advocate for staying in one industry. And there's a good reason for that, because you become an expert, you become well known, you build equity. But as you change industries, let alone change countries, you have to reset everything all over again. And it's a very, very humbling experience, because nobody knows you from Adam. You don't have that industry expertise. And that was the case there. But once again, we applying a lot of the business philosophies that I talked about, having a good bunch of people in my team, we dramatically grew the organization. And I learned a huge amount about business in a more sophisticated way than I had before. Prior to this company, it was very kind of like common sense, adopting what I've read. Now I was getting schooled in a Danaher business system type. The ability, the importance of visual management boards, the importance of daily huddles, the importance of KPIs, the importance of corrective actions once you understand the root causes, doing value stream mapping exercise. It was hard work, but it taught me a huge amount.
So it's an interesting parallel, because you were doing a lot of those things earlier in your career by common sense.
Yes.
And here it sounds like more ingrained in the systems of the company.
Yes.
And you were learning from the way they were doing it. Was that the parent company? Where was that guidance coming from?
It was coming from the corporate office. So they had people who were focused on kind of lean management, lean manufacturing. They had all come from Danaher. And so they were kind of cascading it to the organization. And I joined when they were starting to do that.
Awesome.
And so, I had talked about how I had incorporated visual management boards early in my career. Everyone goes up with a pen and they write the latest bookings number, latest response time number. Now, they're teaching me about, well, what are the metrics that really drive, what are the leading indicators? What are the leading indicators that you should measure so that you can predict what happens in the future? Well, wow, that makes a lot of sense. How can you have a visual board that people can know within 15 seconds, are they winning, are they losing?
Well, it's funny, the work I do with organizations, David, we create what we call a win the week scoreboard, 7 to 13 key metrics for the company that are leading indicators that allow us to know, are we winning or losing? And, we discuss those if they're off target, on target. So I'm a firm believer in all this. Like, if you do that work and have the right cadence, the right things happen.
100%. Yeah, no, I'm glad to hear you had that experience similar. And so they were just teaching a much more sophisticated way of doing things. I mean, the 5 why principle to get to root causes. Like, someone said to me, why is your gross margin not performing? Prior to that, I would come up with some common sense answers, right? We're not able to pass on the material cost inflation to our customers. They were like teaching me, well, but why? But why? Get to the true root cause, use data to validate it. Don't back into your biases. Don't back into antidotes. Get to the true root cause, because if you can do that, you can come up with a containment action. You can come up with corrective actions.
So interesting progression. I hear, hey, again, I'll go back to what I said earlier, kind of a common sense approach to now a formal, systemized, systematic, this is how I do it. And what results did you have there?
Firstly, we were able to build an organization with regional hubs around the world, and so that gave us relevance to customers. And through that relevance, because we were adding value in region around the world, we're able to monetize it and grow revenues. So I mean, we went from, in the last 2 years, we went from $75 million to like 134. So it was quite dramatic revenue
Awesome.
increase in the space of 2 years. So we effectively launched and scaled an aftermarket organization around the world, which was a lot of recruiting, a lot of training. We created centers of excellence, whereby if we need deep subject matter expertise in a certain area, whether it was digital tools or planned preventative maintenance, we could then support the regional businesses with that subject matter expertise. And so top line in terms of organizational infrastructure, it was very successful, and very enjoyable, very tough.
Yeah. And eventually leave there.
So I wanted to get back to the UK for family reasons. I'm originally from the UK, and I had motivation to get back to the UK. And when I was in the UK, I got approached for a managing director role, which is a CEO role, to lead a global organization for a publicly traded company on the London Stock Exchange. And this was my first high profile kind of CEO role. So my experience in China in my mid-20s was a general manager role, and it was certainly high profile, but now I was, much closer to the top. And, like a number of my other roles, I was to some extent learning on the job. I had a gracious team who were very supportive of me, and I had the common sense to listen to them. And we built a very clear path to integrate the business in a way that we would get more economies of scale in our supply chain, more operational efficiencies in the way we distributed products, that we could drive more value to customers. And again, we had a strong 4 years. We navigated COVID, which in Europe, not to downplay how it was in the US, but in Europe, it was treated in some places differently. And so now you're trying to execute a strategy, execute a step change, align the organization in a new direction while you can't interface with them physically. And so that was tremendous experience, tremendous education, but a success.
It's always interesting to go back to that point in time. What did you see with culture? How did you maintain it? How do you keep this team component when everyone's working remotely?
Yeah. Fortunately, by this point, I was relatively conditioned at, slowing down the pace, to spend a good amount of time up front, like just getting to know people personally and building a rapport personally. And I think COVID to some extent accelerated that personal interaction, because now people are working from home for the first time. And you can hear a child in the background crying, or you can see a cat walking across the screen. It just kind of broke down barriers that existed before. And so to answer your question, it was very much communicating, like daily touch points with people. How are you doing? You have to over communicate so much more when you're virtual and not in person. You have to listen a whole lot more. Visual management boards become digital, whereas before they were kind of like on the wall. And so it was just transferring what works in a different way than before.
and I'm sure you found, because I was the same. I'd been using Zoom for a long time prior. I did a lot of remote coaching, but what you found in COVID was, in some ways, the technology could improve the interaction, and other ways it fell way short. So, there are examples like, well, we're in a group of 16. I can put people in a breakout room. I can move easily and there's no distraction. I can bring them back and we can put a big whiteboard on the screen and do a visual kind of interaction. But, there was a learning curve with the technology. There were also limitations. But what you quickly found is there were some advantages, at least for me, in facilitation, in the ability to run an effective meeting. And yet we still, as humans, long to be in the same room.
Yeah.
So, that was my take. Like, yeah, it was overcomable, and there were clearly ways in which we can interact. And it sounds like you guys did that. Um, so you leave that company and head to
I,
Hyperion. Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, I have a question for you actually. So you're doing what you do, you're coaching and you provide doing workshops, but you're having to do it virtually, versus being in person. Did you find a struggle with keeping people's attention on what's going on? Because when you're in person, the distractions are far less. When you're at home, you got your iPad's pinging, your phone's pinging, you can hear the doorbell going. Did you find that an interesting transition?
Yeah, for sure, David. I think there were things that you had to then do differently. Like, well, how do we engage differently? How do we use the technology to give people a break? How do we drive engagement in a different way? And so we did a lot of things tactically. And I'm used to doing those things in person. And then I'm like, well, all right, well, what's a similar way to use technology? And what you found is like some of it worked, some of it didn't. But there's also that, well, I need to give people more breaks. I need to have them get away. And then I also need to be clear about, well, we're interfacing here. I'll call it the discipline of meeting remotely. Your camera's on if you're here.
Yeah.
We see you're engaged, because it's really easy to turn your camera off and go do whatever.
Yes. Yes.
So it's some discipline there. And also that we're going to take 25-minute breaks.
Yes.
I'm going to change the way we would do it in person, which is typically a 10 to 12-minute break, and give you twice as long. And that we're going to use the technology. And I particularly in Zoom love breakout rooms. There's nothing better to move people into small groups, discuss it, come back.
Yeah.
And what you also give people there is a break that if we want to stay on task, we can. If we want to go off for 15 minutes
Yeah.
and talk about the World Cup, okay.
Yeah.
So some forgiveness about progress as well, and go, well, the group will do the heavy lifting. If we have 16 leaders in a Zoom meeting, we'll get what we need out of it. So,
Yes.
it's a new challenge, like everything. And, we now have the same with AI and other things that we haven't broached, but, new tools, new technology, they're all tools. We still need the human mind and interaction. So, you leave the UK company and head to Hyperion. Is this our last transition?
Yes, that's right. So came back to the US, wanted to return here, and now I'm at Hyperion, and it's been phenomenal, with its opportunities and some challenges, but it's been phenomenal.
Yeah. So Hyperion, we talked about early in the podcast, kind of supply material in the elevator space.
Yes.
And also private equity, reporting to a private equity board.
Yes.
Talk about that, which you've had kind of private equity earlier, but this seemed different to me when we first talked, which was
Yes.
true
Yes.
private equity board. Here I'm, reporting there. What did you find early there?
I think, I would say I've been very fortunate, I believe, with my boards. They're immensely value add. They've created a really good safe space to kind of like bounce ideas. What do you think about that? And what do you think about this? So I've been very fortunate. So maybe this is not the case for all private equity boards, but certainly the experience I've had at Hyperion has been the case. The timeline is very acutely focused on in a way that it's not with publicly traded companies. one of the favorite phrases that I was taught by one of my operating partners is, I learned a lot from him, but is think about exit EBITDA and exit EBITDA at a time point. And then what's your roadmap to get to that exit EBITDA? And so that focus on a timeline and pace is much more front and center. And a publicly traded company, there's a lot more compliance, whether it's DEI, ESG, and all these other important things. Private equity, at least the private equity I work for, is very conscientious about doing things the right way for sure. But it's very much, it's certainly focused on performance and results and driving value back to the investors.
Well, David, my take there, having run 3 private equity held companies, it's about value creation, and there's a reason they want value creation. And we tend to talk about it as EBITDA growth, multiple expansion, but it's those two things. It's
Yes.
EBITDA times multiple. So we can look at that in all kinds of ways and go, well, how do we increase our multiple? How do we increase our EBITDA? And that both of those create more value.
Yes.
In what I've shared with a lot of companies that are not yet private equity is think that way before you are. Start to understand that there's a driver here that makes sense at a different pace. Because I think and to be fair to private equity, there's different paces. So some of these want to, this is a 2 to 3 year turn. Some of these are 5, some of these are 10 to 15 and we're holding. And, so you'll find, it's dangerous, I think, always talking about private equity, that they're always doing this, that there's a quick turn. Not all are.
Right.
You're living in that environment. And you've described it well. When you joined Hyperion, what did you find? What was the company like?
No business I've ever joined has been exactly how I imagined it or exactly how I heard it described to me. I think that's been true in every single case. So there you had it.
Which is perfect, because that was my experience. Whatever you think before you walk in the door is different when you walk in the door.
For sure. And I think as you mature in life and in career, you just realize that's just the way things are and just roll with it. Don't get wound up about it. Just, ultimately you're paid for assessing the situation on the ground. And not all boards know acutely what's going on the ground. It kind of depends on what visibility they've been given previously. So look, the organization has phenomenal people, has great history, great brands, great bones, great products. But it was quickly apparent that we needed a vision and a strategy and a roadmap on how to execute that strategy. And so I applied the same thing, in 2025 that I did back in 2007 in China. It's the same principles, which is this get with employees, let's get with customers, let's understand who do we want to be in and how do we go about it and how we execute it. And that David, was the things that were very apparent when I arrived.
I'm curious in that. I've described it for a long time. Kind of, we need to answer 2 questions: why we exist and where are we headed? What do we want to become? I'm curious how you approach that visioning. You're getting input from a bunch of people. I heard that, but what question are you answering for the organization?
Yeah, so I tend to start the conversation in a workshop format with a strong diversity of perspectives. Just taking a step back to the role in the UK, that's probably one of the things that came out of my experience in the UK for that company and during COVID was the importance of diversity of input, diversity of perspectives. Because navigating particularly the lockdown experience and the COVID experience, people were going through a lot. And so the ability to make sure as a CEO, I was in touch with what they were going through by making sure I had diversity. And what I mean by diversity is not everyone thinks the same, has the same experiences. So bringing that forward to Hyperion, when we were doing the workshops, I wanted contrarian views. I wanted a diverse perspective. And so making sure it was almost, soliciting an overwhelming amount of input to distill it down to a clear purpose of who we wanted to be. and why and how we were going to go about it. So I engaged the workforce immensely and I engaged the employees immensely and then distilled it down into what I believe is a very focused vision strategy and roadmap to that strategy.
So talk about that for Hyperion. The output is what? Here's where we're headed. Here's our vision.
Yeah,
How do you
it was,
describe it?
so it was, we need, here's our timeline. Here's the whole period. Where do we want to be at the end of that whole period? What do we want to be to customers? Or what do we want to be to a future buyer? And that's probably another difference, back to your earlier question between kind of publicly traded and private equity is not only the whole period, but what's the narrative? What's the business we're selling to a future buyer? What are they going to discover during due diligence? And so we were factoring in who do we want to be within the time frame that we have and beyond, because we're also building a business for the next turn, the next sponsor. Who do we want to be? Is this truly a competitive differentiator, or is this just another business amongst all the others? And so probably the hardest part of that workshop event was how do we distill it down to a vision and a strategy that makes us different and better than the competitors? And that was particularly hard, but ultimately successful.
And in the end, it's what? What are you guys at Hyperion headed toward? What do you want to become? Why do you exist? In terms of your vision, mission, how do you talk about it?
Yeah, so we provide tailored solutions, whereas many of our competitors provide, here's the catalog, here's the standard solution, take it or leave it. We're very much focused on understanding what our customers' need are, and through a strong technical bench strength in terms of talent, understanding what they need, and then providing a tailored solution to what they need. We also provide services through the entire life cycle of the elevator, which our competitors don't. And then we're very focused on the customer experience, which I know many organizations will claim that they are as well. But we've gone out of our way to create true voice of the customer surveys to understand what's important to the customers, and then deliver an experience to the customer that's different from the competitors in areas such as digital tools. So the ability to interact with us through a digital platform, and to get a simplified buying process, again, is something that we came up with a strategy that's different to our competitors at this time.
So you align the organization through this workshop, get everyone on board, kind of, whatever the right metaphor, rowing in the same direction, understand, here's our, again, shared fate. This is what I want people to believe. I'm sure you also had transition of people. Talk about either infusion of talent. How do I get everyone on board? How do I change or, get this high performing herd in my vernacular? How did you transition there?
Yeah. So one of the things that was, again, very important to be disciplined during this kind of creating of a vision, strategy and tactics is then to design an org structure that executes that, but doesn't just back into what you already have. And that's hard for people to do. So we created an org structure that would execute the strategy and the tactics that we'd come up with. And then we decided to put people into those roles. And in some cases, we didn't have those people. In some cases, they just didn't exist. In some cases, we didn't have the right people. In many cases, we had a great workforce. Having said that, we've had to substantially enhance certain departments to make that a reality. And so there has been a sizable infusion of new talent that I think has made Hyperion a stronger organization and has allowed us to execute things like digital commerce. Like that's a very specialized field. I talked about the customer experience being very critical to how we engage, to how we operate at Hyperion. We very much brought in some of the background that I have with people with a lean management principle to do value stream mapping exercises across the organization, strip the waste out of the process to make it an easier buying experience for our customers.
So I hear a couple things there. You looked and used strategy go forward or vision go forward to determine where the gaps were. You went and found new talent as needed. I'm curious, how have you selected new talent? What's your process? How do you think about it? How do you gauge whether or not their culture fit? All of those challenges of bringing new minds and people into an
Yeah.
existing organization.
Yeah. So I'm relatively agnostic to industry experience. That's not always a popular statement in my company, but I am. Um, uh, as long as they have transferable skills and they have the EQ and the IQ and the self-awareness and the humility to realize they don't know. So during the interview process, I very much test that's kind of self-awareness and that humility.
Mm.
That's been important to me in my career, I believe, and I think it's important to anybody at a leadership role. I look for specific examples that how they can tell me how they move the needle. Like one of my pet peeves with resumes and interviews is it's basically a cut and paste of the job description. I want to know how they drove value. And I want to know, what was it when you inherited it? What was it when you left? And how did you take it from point A to point B? Because if they didn't, or they were involved in that, they can talk with it intimately and with passion.
Yes.
I also very much focus on the psychology of the person. Like what motivates you? What gets under your skin? Because the character has to fit the culture, and the culture is kind of like that humility, that self-awareness, that hard work,
Yeah.
and at sometimes some contrarian thinking.
And do you do any assessments?
For the executive roles, we do, yes. For I should say for director and above, we do online assessments, yes.
And are you doing personality, skill, psychological battery? What are you doing? Just curious.
It's the personality traits, like how do they deal with certain situations under pressure? How does that person fit in with my leadership style, with the organization culture that we have built and we are building,
Awesome.
and for the role they're taking on.
Um, Tell me what's happened at Hyperion during your stint there.
Well, we grow. So
Yeah.
we're meeting our numbers and we're growing. We're having, recently some of the best months we've had in our history. We've improved the supply chain. We kind of de-risked parts of the business by improving some of our supply chain relationships. We are massively investing in product development. So I talked a lot about listening to customers and listening to employees. One of the outcomes of that was that we need to rejuvenate our products. We've developed, and we're further developing e-commerce as a solution to the customers. Again, you listen to our customers, we realized that we were making it a difficult buying experience at times. And so how do we fix that? We fixed that by stripping the waste out of the processes, but also through value stream mapping exercises, but also giving them a new alternative way to buy through e-commerce. We've massively updated the talent in a number of places, and we've incorporated a decentralized operating model whereby we push the responsibility to make decisions on the ground in real time, rather than coming back to a corporate person for a decision.
Yeah. So, David, talk about that because I think many organizations struggle with that.
Yeah.
How have you approached it? How did you outline it? How did you put it in practice? What are the ways in which you drove this decentralized decision making?
Yeah, and as I describe the culture to people, well, firstly, I'll take a step further back. As we identified our strategy, we realized that some of the businesses were different to others in terms of the market conditions and the competitors, and so you had to give some flexibility for execution to the individual business units. So that was kind of identified when we were coming up with our market position, our competitor landscape, and our strategy and our tactics. So local decision making was important, and that wasn't necessarily in place when I started. Number one. Number two, I just believe that centralized decision making isn't the right approach. In many cases, I don't like it personally. I didn't like it when I experienced it, and what I think it produces is the counter to extreme ownership that I look for. And And extreme ownership is obviously a well-known philosophy, but I believe in it. And in order to hold people accountable to that standard, they've got to be put in charge of their business. That doesn't mean that there's no controls. Like, you can't go off and spend $400,000 on a new machinery without going through proper controls. It doesn't mean that we don't have visibility into how the business is performing. That's why we have KPIs and monthly business reviews. But it does mean I'm holding you accountable for your business. It's your P&L. I want you to make decisions locally on the ground. But the flip side to that is I'm going to hold you accountable for results.
Yeah. So I'm curious, when you say extreme ownership, are you referring to the book Extreme Ownership, or are you just that's something, again, you believe in, that we own?
Both.
Okay.
Both.
Fair.
Yeah. So I've read the book and certainly I've gleaned a lot of good habits from the book, but also it's just common sense.
Yeah. Well, and I think they took some heat for the book and then did the follow on, The Dichotomies of Leadership, which I think is a brilliant book as well, which is, yeah, you have to maintain, and you've already subtly said some of that. It is about 100% ownership, but there are central controls, there are metrics, there are things that you have to do, like treat humans well. There's a bunch in their follow-on book that I thought was brilliant, that talk about the subtleties and dichotomies of leadership. Like, it's a complex sport. So in this pursuit of, I call it, drive decision making closer to the ground, the whole decentralized model works remarkably well with, again, some controls that you've talked about. That's been part of your growth. When you look at what's next for Hyperion, what would you say?
Yeah, I think we've still to see the fruits of our investment in product development. So we're going to be bringing some new products to market, both that we designed and manufactured, but also that we are bringing to market through new suppliers that we've found. That's certainly a big deal. The scalability of our e-commerce platform, and the infusion of using AI to help someone identify what part do they need for this application is something that we're working on, as well, that I'm very excited about. And then finally, I think as we continue to drive this organic growth, I would like to make some acquisitions in a few places, but I only want to do that once I know that we have a business system and a culture that can incorporate a new business and not mess it up.
I've lived through that both ways. From a, we'll call it, measure of success, you and Hyperion will be successful when?
We're two-part answer, right? We're successful right now because we're improving the customer experience, which we measure through voice of the customer surveys. We're monetizing that by growing top line and protecting our margins and growing EBITDA. We're attracting talent and retaining talent. So we're keeping people healthy and safe. So we're successful now, and that's measured against prior year actuals. But the ultimate definition of success is giving our investors a strong exit, with a good return on that exit in the next few years. And then maybe we'll do the same thing again for a new bunch of investors.
And in this pursuit of, we'll call it, successful exit, what will be the biggest challenge?
We've talked a lot about a decentralized operating model and talent. That's probably the biggest challenge is making sure we get the right talent in. That's an ongoing exercise. And so that's important. I mean, I've talked a lot about business systems and ideas and philosophies, and it's perhaps a cliche, but it's true. Like, you need the people to execute it, particularly in a decentralized operating model. And so that talent attraction continues to be very important. Everything else in terms of, e-commerce and product development and go-to-market plans, it is on course, but we just need to make sure we continue to bring in the right talent to execute it.
Awesome. Just a couple closing questions that I think always help the audience digest the episode. what do you believe about leadership now that you didn't believe when you were 26?
The I think the importance of engaging with the organization personally. Um, especially as you get to a large scale organization, like your time is at a premium. Like there's a lot on you. But you can't then lock yourself in a room and in an ivory tower and in meetings. You have to engage with the workforce. And so the ability to kind of engage with the workforce, and communicate to them directly and listen to them directly is massively important. That'd be number one. And number two would be, at the age of 26, as a small business, I was very hands-on. And so there is a real danger as you continue that operating methodology that you become a bottleneck to the organization. And so you realize later in your career, it's not the hundreds of things that you do in a week. It's the one or two things that you do in a week that really move the needle. And prioritizing that and being able to step back and allow people to do what they need to do because you have the right people so that you can focus on the things that only a CEO can focus on, would be the second one.
Well, it's funny, David, because that was my reflection. So 3-time CEO, you make all the mistakes, you learn. And I've told people that coming out of my second, moving to the third CEO stint, that I realized a couple things that I actually want to feel lazy as a CEO. And what I meant by that was I wanted such a powerful team that I was no longer doing the work. And the work that I was doing, I told everyone was fourfold. It was vision, values, expectation, and engagement. And what I meant by that is cast a really strong vision, put real values in place and live them. This is how we act and behave here. These are the standards, really high expectations, and then engage on the first three. And
Yes.
and you've described that in many ways, which is I need to be the standard bearer for the organization and engage in those standards remarkably passionately and consistently. And you've talked about it as I need to go have those conversations with people. I need to spend time. What do you feel you still need to improve on to be a better CEO?
Ooh, great question. I would love to continue to get better at scaling an organization at pace and bringing and making sure everyone can keep up with that pace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lastly, what belief are you asking the Hyperion team to act on? Here's what we believe. Here's what I want you to act on.
Extreme ownership, humility.
Oh,
Yeah.
awesome. David, if people want to find more about you, follow your journey, follow Hyperion, where should they go?
The easiest way and probably the only way is on LinkedIn. If you type in David Hewitt, CEO, Charlotte, North Carolina, I'll pop up. I was very fortunate to have people help me early in my career and be very generous with their time, and I'm happy to repay that if people are interested as well.
David, thanks for sharing all the lessons. A remarkably interesting journey. You were willing to share success, mistakes, the evolution of you as a leader, and that the work's still ahead, which is awesome. So thanks so much for sharing and appreciate your time today.
Thanks, David.